In 1993, three engineers sat down at a Denny's restaurant in East San Jose, California. No fancy office, no investors waiting outside, no guarantee that anything they were about to plan would survive longer than a few months. They grabbed a table, pulled out some napkins, and started sketching out an idea that most people in Silicon Valley would have laughed at if they had known about it. One of those three men was a 30-year-old immigrant from Taiwan named Jensen Huang. And the idea he was sketching on that napkin, the idea that his two partners were honestly not even completely sure about yet, was that computers would one day need to process visual information at a speed and scale that existing technology couldn't come close to handling. Most people in the industry thought graphics processing was a niche, a feature for video games and nothing more. Jensen Huang thought it was the future of computing itself. 30 years later, the napkin sketch became a company worth more than $3 trillion, making NVIDIA the most valuable semiconductor company in human history and one of the most important technology companies ever created. But here is what almost nobody tells you about this story. The path between that Denny's restaurant and $3 trillion was not a straight line. It was filled with near bankruptcy, catastrophic product failures, decisions that looked completely wrong for years before they turned out to be right, and a man who was willing to stay committed to a vision that the entire industry told him was either too early, too risky, or simply wrong. This is the real story of how Jensen Huang built NVIDIA into a trillion-dollar giant. And more importantly, this is the story of what he saw that everyone else completely missed. Before we get into the company itself, we need to understand where Jensen Huang came from, because his background explains almost everything about how he eventually built NVIDIA. He was born in Taipei, Taiwan, in 1963, and his early childhood was by any measure unstable. When he was 9 years old, his parents made the difficult decision to send him and his brother to live with relatives in the United States, hoping to give them access to better educational opportunities. But through a series of miscommunications, Jensen ended up not with the stable, comfortable relatives his parents had intended, but at a school in Kentucky that was, putting it generously, extremely rough. He has talked about this period in interviews, describing how he shared a dormitory room with a teenager who had a tattoo on his face, and how he learned very quickly to navigate environments that were far more unpredictable and dangerous than anything he had experienced in Taiwan. But here's what most people miss about this period of his life. Instead of withdrawing or becoming bitter about the circumstances, young Jensen adapted. He became a table tennis champion at the school, not because he had some natural gift for it, but because he practiced obsessively and figured out how to compete effectively in whatever environment he found himself in. This adaptability, this ability to look at a difficult or unfamiliar situation and find a way to compete and eventually dominate within it, became the defining characteristic of how he would later build and run NVIDIA through decades of challenges that would have ended most companies permanently. He eventually transferred to a more conventional school, excelled academically, and went on to study electrical engineering at Oregon State University, later earning a master's degree in electrical engineering from Stanford. After graduation, he went to work at AMD and then at LSI Logic, where he spent years learning the semiconductor industry from the inside. He was good at his job. By his late 20s, he was earning a solid salary, building a real career, and he had every reason to stay exactly where he was and continue climbing a ladder that was already treating him well. But here is where the story becomes fascinating. Jensen Huang was sitting inside an established, successful company, watching the entire industry move in a direction that he believed was slightly wrong, or at least incomplete. Everyone in semiconductors was focused on making central processing units faster and more powerful. The CPU was the brain of the computer, and making brains faster was the obvious priority. Jensen kept looking at graphics, at the way computers rendered images and processed visual data, and he kept seeing something that nobody around him seemed to be paying attention to. Graphics processing was not just a feature, it was a fundamentally different way of doing computation. one that involved processing thousands of small calculations simultaneously rather than a smaller number of large calculations sequentially. And if you could get really good at parallel computation, at doing enormous numbers of smaller calculations at the same time, the applications went far beyond just making video games look better. Most people in the industry were not thinking this way in 1993. Jensen Huang was. And that gap between what he saw and what everyone else was focused on is where the entire NVIDIA story begins. At 30 years old, Jensen co-founded NVIDIA with Chris Malachowski and Curtis Preem, two engineers he had connected with through his work in the industry. The company's initial focus was on building graphics processing units, chips specifically designed to handle the visual rendering demands of video games and multimedia applications. This was a legitimate market, but it was considered a niche. The serious money, the serious talent, the serious investors were all focused on CPUs, on enterprise computing, on the businesses that were clearly driving the digital economy at the time. Graphics chips were considered a supporting act, not a leading one. NVIDIA was, in the eyes of most of the industry, a company chasing a relatively small corner of a very large market. What those observers could not see was that Jensen was not actually building a graphics company. He was building a parallel computing company. The graphics market was simply the first place where the technology was commercially viable and fundable. The real vision was always much larger. But here is what most people don't know about NVIDIA's first several years in business. They almost didn't make it, not once, but multiple times. The company's first major product, a chip called NV1, was released in 1995 and was, to put it plainly, a failure. It used a technical approach to rendering graphics called quadratic surfaces that turned out to be incompatible with the direction the entire industry was moving. While NVIDIA was building chips optimized for one rendering approach, the rest of the industry was standardizing around a different approach entirely. The NV1 was not a bad chip in isolation. It just didn't work with what everyone else was building, which in the technology business is essentially the same as being a bad chip. Sales were poor, developer support was almost non-existent, and the company burned through its initial funding faster than anyone had planned. At this point, most startups would have either pivoted dramatically or simply shut down. What happened next shocked everyone who was watching. Jensen Huang made a decision that very few founders would have had the nerve to make in that situation. Instead of gradually adjusting their approach, NVIDIA essentially threw out most of what they had built and completely redesigned their entire chip architecture from the ground up. They moved aggressively toward the industry-standard rendering approach, Microsoft's Direct 3D, and began working at a pace that was, by the accounts of people who were there, genuinely extreme. Engineers worked days, nights, and weekends. The culture Jensen built was demanding in a way that many people outside the company found difficult to understand. He expected enormous amounts from his team and gave enormous amounts of himself in return. He was not asking people to work hard while he managed from a distance. He was in the building, involved in technical decisions, pushing alongside everyone else. The result was a chip called the Riva 128, released in 1997, which was not just a technical success but a commercial one. It was fast, it was compatible, and it was released at a moment when the PC gaming market was exploding. NVIDIA went from near death to genuine momentum in what felt like a surprisingly short period of time. But here's what is important to understand about this moment, because it is easy to look back and see it as simply a product success story. What actually happened was something more significant. Jensen Huang had demonstrated for the first time, but not the last, a willingness to make brutal company-level decisions, to throw away sunk costs, to accept short-term pain in exchange for getting the fundamentals right. That would define how NVIDIA operated for the next 3 decades. Most companies become emotionally attached to the work they have already done. They find it psychologically difficult to abandon a failing approach, even when the evidence clearly supports doing exactly that. Jensen had apparently found a way to avoid this particular trap. and it would save the company more than once in the years to come. The real turning point, the moment when NVIDIA stopped being a successful niche company and started becoming something much more significant, came with the release of the GeForce 256 in 1999. Jensen and his team made a deliberate choice with this product to call it a GPU, a graphics processing unit, rather than using the existing industry terminology. This was not just a marketing decision, it was a conceptual statement. The GeForce 256 could handle geometry calculations that had previously been done by the CPU, taking genuine computational work off the main processor and onto a specialized chip. The GPU was not a helper for the CPU. It was a separate, specialized, increasingly powerful processor in its own right. The language mattered because the language shaped how developers, investors, and eventually the entire industry thought about what graphics chips were actually for. The next several years saw NVIDIA grow into the dominant force in graphics processing for consumer PCs, consistently releasing new GPU architectures that stayed ahead of their primary competitor, ATI, through a combination of engineering excellence and a product release cadence that kept the competition perpetually playing catch-up. The company went public in 1999 and generated genuine wealth for early investors and employees. Jensen Huang became, by conventional measures, a very successful technology executive. But the bigger vision, the one he had carried since before the company even existed, the one about parallel computing being the future of all computing rather than just graphics, had not yet been fully realized. That chapter was still coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything. In 2006, NVIDIA released something called CUDA, which stands for Compute Unified Device Architecture. And this is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating in a way that most coverage of NVIDIA completely misses. CUDA was not a product in the traditional sense. It was a programming platform, a way for software developers to write programs that could run directly on NVIDIA's GPUs rather than on a CPU. For the first time, the enormous parallel processing power of a GPU could be used for general-purpose computation, for scientific simulation, for financial modeling, for research, for any application where you needed to do a very large number of calculations simultaneously rather than a smaller number sequentially. Jensen Huang understood exactly what this meant, even though the market for it in 2006 was essentially zero. There were no major commercial applications for GPU-based general computation yet. There were a handful of researchers experimenting with it, a small community of scientists who had noticed that certain kinds of calculations ran dramatically faster on a GPU than on a CPU, and were curious about what that might eventually enable. The commercial GPU market, the video game market, was where NVIDIA's actual revenue came from. CUDA was a bet on a future that did not yet commercially exist. Most rational technology executives, facing investors who expected quarterly revenue growth and a competitive landscape that required constant reinvestment in core products, would not have made this bet. They would have focused resources on the market that was actually paying the bills. Jensen Huang invested in CUDA anyway, and he kept investing in it year after year, building out developer tools, documentation, relationships with researchers, all for a commercial payoff that remained years in the future and was genuinely not guaranteed to ever materialize. This is the single decision that most people point to as the foundation of everything that came after, and that assessment is essentially correct. But it is worth asking why Jensen made this decision when almost no one else could see the case for it. The answer reveals something important about how he thinks. Jensen has talked in various interviews about having a very long time horizon for his thinking, about being willing to make investments that will not pay off for 5, 10, or even 15 years, as long as the underlying reasoning is sound. Most corporate executives are constrained by quarterly earnings cycles, by investor expectations, by the natural human tendency to discount things that are far in the future relative to things that are immediate. Jensen seemed to have an unusual ability to hold a long-term conviction and continue acting on it even when the short-term evidence was ambiguous or even negative. By the early 2010s, researchers working in artificial intelligence and machine learning had discovered something that would eventually reshape the entire technology industry. Training neural networks, the algorithms that power modern AI, required exactly the kind of massive parallel computation that NVIDIA's GPUs had been designed to do. A neural network during training needs to perform billions of small mathematical operations simultaneously, adjusting millions or billions of parameters in response to data. A CPU, optimized for sequential processing of complex instructions, handles this kind of workload relatively poorly. A GPU, designed from the ground up to do enormous numbers of simpler operations simultaneously, handles it extraordinarily well. The fit between GPU architecture and neural network training was not a coincidence that Jensen Huang had somehow arranged in advance. But it was a consequence of the fundamental insight he had started with 30 years earlier. That parallel processing, doing many things at once rather than one thing at a time very quickly, was going to become increasingly central to what computing needed to do. When deep learning began to demonstrate genuinely remarkable results around 2012, when AlexNet, a neural network trained on NVIDIA GPUs, won a major image recognition competition by a margin that shocked the research community, the relevance of NVIDIA's technology to artificial intelligence became suddenly dramatically visible to people who had not been paying close attention. Demand for NVIDIA's data center, GPUs, the chips used to train large AI models, began to grow in a way that the company's existing production capacity had not been built to handle. Jensen Huang and his team began making a series of rapid decisions to reorient the company toward this new, enormous market while maintaining their dominant position in the gaming GPU market that had historically been their core business. The pace of investment accelerated dramatically. NVIDIA began designing chip architectures specifically optimized for AI training and inference rather than just for graphics rendering. Data center revenue, which had been a relatively small part of NVIDIA's business for most of its history, began to grow at rates that were genuinely difficult to comprehend. The companies building large AI systems, OpenAI, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, every major technology company with serious AI ambitions needed NVIDIA's GPUs in quantities that pushed the limits of the global semiconductor supply chain. Jensen Huang found himself, in his late 50s, running not a successful niche graphics chip company, but the company that was supplying the fundamental hardware infrastructure for the most significant technology transition in decades. But here is something worth reflecting on for a moment, because this is the part of the story where the real business lesson lives. When ChatGPT launched in late 2022 and demonstrated to a mass audience what large language models could actually do, the world suddenly woke up to the importance of AI infrastructure. NVIDIA's stock began rising at a pace that made observers compare it to the most dramatic stock movements in modern market history. Jensen Huang became one of the wealthiest people on Earth seemingly overnight, at least in terms of public visibility. But the investments that created that outcome had been made 15, 20, 30 years earlier. The CUDA platform that made NVIDIA essential to AI researchers had been built and maintained for over 15 years before the commercial AI market was large enough to reward that investment at scale. The data center GPU business that became the company's largest and fastest growing segment had been invested in for years before it was obvious to anyone outside the company that it would eventually become this significant. This is what separates the genuinely extraordinary business stories from the merely impressive ones. It is easy to look at NVIDIA today and admire the outcome. It is harder and more useful to understand the specific decisions that were made years or decades earlier under conditions of genuine uncertainty, without the benefit of knowing how the story would eventually turn out. That created the conditions for that outcome to be possible. There are real lessons in this story that go beyond admiring Jensen Huang's specific choices, lessons that apply to anyone trying to build something significant in any field. The first is that competitive advantage built on genuine technological insight tends to be far more durable than competitive advantage built on execution alone. NVIDIA's position in AI computing is difficult to replicate, not because they work harder than potential competitors, though they do work extremely hard, but because they have been building the software ecosystem, the developer relationships, the architectural expertise, and the manufacturing partnerships for this specific type of computing for over 15 years. That kind of head start cannot be closed quickly, regardless of how much money a competitor is willing to spend. The second lesson is about the relationship between patience and conviction. Jensen Huang invested in CUDA for years without a clear commercial return. He maintained a vision about the future of computing that most of his industry did not share. He was not simply being stubborn, he was being patient about a carefully reasoned conviction. And he continued gathering evidence and refining his understanding while staying committed to the underlying direction. There is an important difference between stubbornly holding on to a bad idea and patiently holding on to a good one. And the difference is not always obvious in real time, which is exactly what makes this kind of decision so difficult to make and so valuable when it turns out to be right. The third lesson is about the importance of building platforms rather than just products. CUDA transformed NVIDIA from a chip company into an ecosystem. Once AI researchers and eventually commercial AI developers built their tools, their workflows, their entire technical infrastructure on top of CUDA, switching away from NVIDIA's GPUs became not just technically challenging, but practically impossible for many organizations. Platform thinking, building something that others build on top of, creates a kind of compounding advantage that straight product competition rarely produces. So here's the question worth sitting with as you think about this story. What is the version of parallel computing in your own field, the thing that most people around you are treating as a niche or a supporting feature, that you can see is actually going to become central to everything? Because that question, asked honestly and answered with enough patience and conviction to actually act on the answer, is exactly how this story started. 3 engineers at a Denny's restaurant, 1 napkin, 1 idea that most of the industry would have dismissed, and 30 years of staying committed to a vision that the world eventually caught up to. If this story gave you a new way of understanding how genuine, lasting business success actually gets built, subscribe to $1 Billion Stories right now, because every week we go this deep into the real decisions, the real risks, and the real reasoning behind the companies and the people who change the world. Leave a comment below telling me which part of Jensen Huang's story surprised you the most, whether it was the near bankruptcy in the early years, the CUDA bet, or something else entirely. Like this video if you made it all the way through, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and we will see you in the next one.